he's been in office now for 22 years, but it's not like he just suddenly appeared on the scenes. You know, the irony of the moment is that he is the product of World War II. His whole presidency, most recently, since he returned to being president again in 2011, 2012, when he'd spent a brief period as prime minister, he started to hone in on his narrative about World War II, the Great Fatherland War, and making that the kind of basis of this phase of his presidency. And this is the irony of history. His parents, both of them, were survivors of the siege of Leningrad. Basically, in 1942, 80 years ago, the siege of Leningrad had already been going on for, getting on to a year. I mean, it was almost, 2+ years, 1941 to well into, 1943, 44, before the siege was fully ended. And his parents were residents of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. He had an older brother he never met because he's born in 1952, who died as a result of starvation and disease during the war and was buried in a mass grave. And Putin has made a big thing of visiting this mass grave and commemorating the siege of Leningrad, which is ironic given what he's doing now in all of the cities that we see in Ukraine, which were also what was called hero cities during World War II, because they were also attacked by Nazi Germany. His mother almost died as well. And there's a story about how she was basically at death's door and was being actually carried out as a corpse. People thought she died. Now, we don't know if this is true, but this is Putin's own narrative about this. So it's important to bear this in mind. That she was being put on a cart with other bodies. When his father returns from the front, it's got that dramatic cinematic element to it. So it may be, kind of exaggerated or even made up. But it's a story that he tells. And his father has come back from fighting behind enemy lines as a partisan-like fighter in what's now the territory of Estonia, basically trying to get rid of collaborators with the Nazis, rearguard action against the Nazi forces, and burning down anything that the Nazis, could use in various villages and things on the approaches to Leningrad. His own story, his own personal narrative is about this dark period, not just in Soviet and Russian history, but in European history. And the story sort of suggests that he is also a never again. And he's launched this war into Ukraine on all kinds of pretexts. One of them is NATO, others is spats with the United States. But part of it has been, he said, the denazification of Ukraine, all the way throughout history. The Ukrainian lands of modern Ukraine have been pulled in all kinds of different directions. But there was a horrific period in the run-up to World War II where the region suffered from a great famine inflicted upon them by the center of the Soviet Union. And then straight into a war where they were devastated, most of the fighting was going on. It's certainly true that, as in many other countries as well, that there were Nazi sympathizers and, let's just say, nationalist partisans, because Ukraine, like many other countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, had the same thing. Russia, frankly, itself, has this as well, had, nationalist fighters and partisan movements. But of course, Ukraine was the site of the mass slaughter of Jews within the Russian Empire. And in the center of Kiev, there is Babyn Yar, the ravine which I and many others who visited, either in the Soviet period or in contemporary period, have seen, where tens of thousands of Jewish citizens of Kiev and the surrounding villages were rounded up and shot and basically pushed into this ravine, which is one of the world's largest mass graves. The reason that there were so many Jews in Ukraine, as well as in neighboring Belarus, is of course an artifact of history. We've all heard the term the Pale of Settlement. I mean, we still use that. People have been saying to me recently, what Vladimir Putin is doing is beyond the pale. That expression comes right from that period in Tsarist history, where the Jews of the Russian Empire were confined to live in what we translate as the Pale of Settlement, different word in Russia, but was the kind of constraints of settlement for the Jewish citizens of the empire, because they weren't allowed at that point to live in big cities and to engage in many of the occupations that Russians were that moved into the middle class. So as the result of history, the largest concentrations of Jewish population were in the lands of Ukraine. And the contemporary president of Ukraine, the person that we're watching all the time on the news and hoping that he survives, is, of course, a Jew, Vlodimir Zelensky, from that area, whose family, some of them perished in Babyn Yar, were shot by the Nazis, others fought against the Nazis. Others managed to escape the Holocaust. And Putin, and he's also a Russian speaker, and Putin is accusing Zelensky of being a Nazi fascist. He also says he's drug-addled, says he takes cocaine. There's not much evidence of, of this either. And that he is trying to denazify Ukraine. And on other occasions, he stood next to Chancellor Merkel of Germany. And he once actually said in front of her, and she stood there obviously not knowing how to react, that the Holocaust was perpetrated by Ukrainians during World War II, not Germany at all, trying to sort of absolve her. And, the Germans, of course, don't need any absolution. They've done it themselves in terms of going through their history. They're well aware of what they've done. They're commenting on this at the moment. But that was part of his myth-making about Ukraine. So, I'm just saying all of this to point out that this is Vladimir Putin has been steeped and is a product, steeped in the history of World War II, a product of the World War II history, but is manipulating it in a gross and sometimes farcical but horrific fashion to justify his actions in moving into Ukraine. Because if you don't know your own history, you actually fall prey to other people manipulating it for you and telling a version for their own purposes. Because what Putin is trying to do is to sell us his version of history and force it on the Ukrainians as well, because he's denying their history. And he has wrapped himself up here in the image of his namesake. And it's kind of ridiculous on the surface of it, but this is exactly what's happening. So his first name, and then the Russians have a patronymic after their father's name. He's Vladimir Vladimirovich. So he's two times Vladimir. And he's basically trying to cloak himself in the garb of an even, earlier Grand Prince Vladimir, who was actually Grand Prince of Kiev. So not only is he taking us back, 80 years, World War II, he's taking us back even further into the annals of time to the 10th century, because Vladimir, Grand Prince of Kiev, was the prince who took on Christianity in Russia. And myth has it that he was basically baptized in this town of Chersones on the Crimean Peninsula. So this was his justification for taking Crimea in 2014, and he went on a great long historical treatise, going back to the annexation of Crimea by Catherine the Great, but going back even further to the fact that Grand Prince Vladimir, who is credited again in myth-making as the sort of the progenitor of Muscovy and the greater Russian Empire, was baptized there, so Crimea has to be back in Russia. Now, if we kind of look back to the 10th century, all of us have read about the Vikings and all the kind of other sort of histories in that kind of period at some point. There wasn't a state. There was a bunch of, kind of these principalities were, just guys with a gang, kind of in charge of various things. And this is, the kind of the period when, you had the Mongol invasions, and all these were like sort of warring Viking groups, because it's the dynasty that set up all these principalities in Russia were actually Vikings who'd come down the rivers. And I know a thing or two about Vikings coming from the north of England. All of our myths are about fighting with the Vikings. And then if you do 1, 2, 3 and Me, or, Ancestry.com, you found that everybody in Britain's about 6% Viking or something. So they obviously stayed around a bit. So all of our myths of raping and pillaging and moving on are not true. And whoever writes the history depicts them. And all the monks whose monasteries got raided by Vikings wrote all the histories because the Vikings didn't write. So, you think back in the uses of history, and you get all of this myth making. And so Vladimir Putin is making his own myth about Grand Prince Vladimir, who actually happened to be the Prince of Kiev at the time. Now, Zelensky's first name is Vlodimir. What's Vlodimir? It's the Ukrainian version of Vladimir. And in history, Grand Prince Vladimir was actually Grand Prince Vlodimir of Kiev. And Putin has stripped off the Kiev bit of the title, and he's built a big statue of Grand Prince Vladimir right outside of the Kremlin. It's highly unlikely that Grand Prince Vladimir was ever there in that spot. If he was, really from, Kiev and Ukrainian lands, back in the day. It's a long way to go on horseback or foot, to kind of get to, and there was other princes in Muscovy and in that territory at the time. So in a way, this is now Putin battling the battle of the Vladimir versus Volodymyr for who gets to have the history of Kiev and the history of Ukraine and Russia. And Putin is always taking on the garb of these various. He clearly sees himself as a czar or a grand prince, and clearly sees himself as part of history, but his version of history. He's also very much in the business of manipulating NATO. And that, with all due respect to Professor Mearsheimer, we're all kind of falling into where exactly he wants, into the sort of discursive traps that he wants us to be basically blaming ourselves for all of this. And I just want to make very clear that only one person is responsible for this invasion of Ukraine. That's Vladimir Putin. He decided to do this. He didn't have to, with a very small group of people. It was clearly planned in secret with a tiny group of military people around him. It's clear that many of the soldiers who have gone in didn't even know that this was going to happen. They thought they were going into exercises. This is not on the Russian people. So we have to be very careful about how we think about this. And, you know, just like Adolf Hitler made a decision to invade, or anybody who makes a decision at any kind of point, you know, that's really on them. Now, were there lots of kind of motivations and drivers in Putin's mind? Yes. And, you know, we've talked about some of the historical ones, which, you know, create a kind of a basis for things. Where NATO is concerned, there is a very complex history. And I just also want to point out that in the early 1990s, just immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of pressure put on by Russian nationalist figures, including the mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, many people in the Duma, including the head of the Communist Party, the head of, you know, what became known as the Liberal Democrats, which weren't very liberal or democratic, Mr. Zhirinovsky, and a whole host of others, on this concerns about Ukraine going in a different direction to the United States. It wasn't the United States at the time, to Russia. Sorry, bit of a Freudian slip there, I guess, because Putin always thinks the United States is trying to, you know, pull Ukraine away. So the very early 1990s, we have to just think back to how the Soviet Union was dissolved, because it didn't collapse. Boris Yeltsin, with the then presidents of Belarus and Ukraine, got together in a big hunting lodge in the middle of the Belarusian woods and dissolved the Soviet Union and created a Commonwealth of Independent States to replace it, because they were all in a power struggle with Mikhail Gorbachev at the center. There's a very good but thick book, if anybody's got some reading time on their hands, by a professor in London, but originally from Russia, Vladislav Zubok, called Collapse, which lays all of this out in very good detail. But the point is that Yeltsin wanted to get rid of the Soviet Union, but he thought that the Commonwealth of Independent States would keep the band together, kind of thing. But of course, all of the other republics went off in their own way. And eventually, Ukraine pulled out of the Commonwealth of Independent States, wanting to have its own independence. It was more civilized divorce, not kind of keeping everything together. And in the early 1990s, Ukraine had inherited a nuclear arsenal from the Soviet Union, same as Belarus. So Belarus and Ukraine were suddenly two of the, and along with Kazakhstan as well, three of the other largest nuclear powers in the world, because they had all of the nuclear weapons that were stationed there during the Soviet period. And we, the United States, was pushed on Ukraine to give up this arsenal, to have them, I mean, you remember this as well, to get it dismantled, because we were worried about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, particularly as a lot of these were ICBMs. And, you know, sitting here in Denver, Colorado, you know, being or two about that, lots of worries about, you know, what might happen there. And there was a lot of pressure from Russians on Ukraine at the time, threats to take Crimea, threats to do a lot of the things that are happening right now. And the United Kingdom and the United States stepped in, and we gave Ukraine a guarantee that obviously wasn't worth a thing, called the Budapest Memorandum, for their territorial integrity, independence, and sovereignty if they gave up the nuclear weapons and had them transferred to Russia for dismantling. This was before any discussion about NATO. And we had at that time something called the Partnership for Peace, which was sort of an alternate organization that Russia was part of, and others for, you know, military to military relationships and elsewhere. So right from the very beginning, there was pressure on Ukraine. So that sort of suggests that, you know, NATO might have exacerbated this when it came along, but there was already animosity emerging. But Yeltsin didn't want to do anything about it. Yeltsin himself didn't join in with all of this pressure. Now, it could be because Russia was weak at the time and there was a lot happening. But I think Yeltsin himself just didn't see the point of basically trying to take any kind of military action against Ukraine. Now, since 1999, on the bombing of Belgrade, that has been one of the issues that shaped Putin's views and other views. And 2008 and the open door to Georgia and Russia fits into this as well. But I just want to talk about 1999 for a minute, because 1999, I think, is the point when Putin and other people, and Putin's not even in the presidency at this point, start to think differently about NATO in Russia as much a larger group, because the bombing of Belgrade became a NATO operation under the leadership of the United States. It was kind of a last resort after we hadn't intervened in the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, given what was happening, the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Kosovo Albanians by Serbia. But there wasn't an attack on a NATO member country by Serbia. And of course, you know, we know that the usual trigger for a NATO intervention is an Article 5 trigger. And so the Russians saw this across the whole board and suddenly thought, hang on a second, NATO isn't what everybody was saying to us. NATO is actually an offensive military alliance, not defensive. There was no trigger of an attack here. Although we used NATO because we needed the coordination. We wanted to have a coalition to basically push back against what Milosevic was doing. And then, of course, we used NATO later on in Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan in different ways as well. And so for someone like Putin, who grew up in the Cold War, was in the KGB, he's looked upon all of this with great suspicion. So this is where Mearsheimer and others are right, that Putin's interpretation of NATO is not as a benign, military coalition that's purely defensive and that is out there, trying to, just use its mechanisms for coordination in crises, but as something that could potentially, in his view, be used against Russia at some point. And so we should always have been mindful of that and trying to figure out how to mitigate Russia's likely reactions and concerns. But if you see what happened in the pressure on Ukraine in the early 1990s, before NATO was even an option, you can see that there's been a really long tail to Russian desires, that feed into Putin's views of seizing back control over Ukraine. Look, I think most people don't want to see something like this coming, right? I mean, it's just precisely, how we started about thinking of horrors of 80 years ago. We've said never again. And, we've always sort of convinced ourselves that all of the other conflicts that have been sort of happening around the world, and particularly in this past 30 years since the collapse of or the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that, these haven't been interconnected. That, that's happening over there. It's got a kind of separate explanation. We don't have to pay much attention to it. And yet, when you look at what happened in Syria, for example, this is in many respects a product of World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And, sort of disputes about the whole disposition of territory and, relationships in the Middle East. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, he was basically talking about Kuwait as an accident of history, a bunch of, French and British over a gin and tonic and a martini, maybe, kind of drawing lines in the map after the end of the Ottoman Empire, which actually is probably correct. I mean, that was, it was carved up. We're still fighting out all those territorial disputes in that period. Greece and Turkey still have a standoff in the Aegean, over, various islands as a result of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. There's an awful lot of threads that do go back, not just 80 years, but 100 years, to those kind of the unravelings of empires in the 1900s after World War I and during that time frame. And, Russia and Putin live in that history. Putin's kind of reason for intervening in Syria was he was seeing this was like an opportunity for Russia to get the kind of warm water port in the Eastern Mediterranean that not just Tsars, but, in kind of more recent period, the Soviet Union had wanted to get. That's partly why he intervened to, prop up Assad. And we've just been, in a way, ignoring all of the connections between things because it's more convenient for us. First of all, then we don't have to intervene and then kind of think about what we're going to do to kind of see these as discrete. Now, it's the same with Georgia in 2008. I was the national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the time, as was mentioned, and it really weighs very heavily on me in that period. I was obviously much younger than I am now. I don't feel like I did a very good job of explaining the warning because it was my job to warn President Bush and others of his cabinet that we foresaw that there might be an invasion of Georgia. And the reason was because of the NATO decision to provide an open door for Ukraine and Georgia. We'd actually advised against that being put on the table in Bucharest in April of 2008, because we knew there was a lot of resistance on the part of the vast majority of our NATO allies. There was also not a lot of support for NATO membership inside of Ukraine itself. It was only around 20-odd%. And there was in Georgia much higher support, but that this was kind of more of a sort of an elite project. And we hadn't prepared the diplomacy for it because the requests from the Georgians and the Ukrainians, as you might recall, came very late, just a couple of months before the summit. And already the Germans and many others said, no, absolutely not. They're not going to get a membership action plan.